David, are you there?
I sure am.
Great. Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, I gave you a glowing introduction while you were logging in. So I know you know what you've done, so I'm not going to repeat that again. But
yeah, who am I? I'd like to hear about myself.
Well, we're just really delighted to have you here with us today, and we have quite a good crowd on with us. Many of them are educators, and I know that they're anxious to hear about it. So if it's okay with you, we'll just get started.
Let's do that, and I apologize for being a few minutes late to everyone.
But technology is our friend and our foe sometimes.
Yes, indeed.
So tell us a little bit about how you became interested in this whole area and what really inspired you to tackle this subject for this book, for your genius and all of us.
Well, I guess there are two answers to that. The first is just a very human response, which is that I think we all are just fascinated by this question of how we get good at stuff, why we don't get good at other stuff, where our abilities come from, how we improve them, why we can't improve them, et cetera, et cetera. So I think everyone, thinks about this stuff, whether they think about it, consciously or subconsciously. It bothers some of us. It delights, others of us. So the basic questions that go into this book and this conversation are things that I think I've been wondering about my whole life. The specific entryway to come up with the answers that I've come up with started, I guess, about 5 or 6 years ago, in the middle of the last book I was working on, which was a book about chess, and it was I was trying to answer this question about why chess was so enduring and widespread, why it appealed to every age group, and why it appealed to every culture. And so I was trying to answer this kind of mystery of chess's ubiquity and popularity, endurance. And I wrote a book called The Immortal Game about chess, and in the process, the one thing I didn't do was get very good at chess. I'm still a very mediocre player, but I learned a lot about the game and people's attraction to it. And I learned that chess has actually been used in science a lot to study the mind. And so I ended up spending a few months kind of diving into the literature of talent, which, as I'm sure everyone listening knows, everyone listening right now knows, has evolved quite a bit in the last over the last decade. There's just an amazing amount of research that's gone into talent and neurology and neuroscience and plasticity, and also into genetics and into intelligence. All these different things that come together that make up what makes us good at stuff. What talent is. And so in the course of writing this book, I was just kind of blown away at how much the scientists seem to know about talent, and how there seemed to be an emerging consensus, if you looked at these different schools of these different pieces of science, that there was this real interesting story to tell, but it wasn't really being told yet for the general public. And I thought, well, there's something I could write a book about. What I tend to do in my work is try to do two things. Number one, I follow my own fascinations, because I know I'm not good at anything that I'm not really fascinated with. And number two, I try to see if there's a niche, something that just hasn't quite been done to satisfy my own interests on a certain subject, and I try to fill that little, if there is a little hole, I try to fill it.
Yeah, well, it was certainly fascinating to read. And so the book is obviously about talent, ability, intelligence, IQ. I mean, we have lots, as you pointed out, lots and lots of names for this. Do you have a definition? If someone said to you, so what is intelligence? What is talent? How would you answer that?
I should have a really good short answer for that, shouldn't I? The thing I like to emphasize is that my little catchphrase is that talent is not a thing, it's a process, and you could say the same thing about intelligence. And so I like to emphasize that we have, I think, been traditionally taught that we're all born with a certain amount of stuff, a certain amount of potential in certain abilities and certain kinds of intelligence, depending on how you think about intelligence, but that at some point it's rooted in each of us having this genetic amount of stuff, this information that's built into our genes that says, well, you basically have an IQ of this, and you have athletic ability, or you don't have athletic, or at least you have athletic potential. You don't have athletic potential. You have music potential. You don't have musical potential. So we tend to we've been taught it's really ingrained in our culture and our minds that talent and intelligence are something that we have a certain amount of, and that the best we can hope for in our lives is to develop that stuff that we have within us. And the way I've come to think of it, with the help of lots and lots of scientists, of course, is that all of this stuff is a process. It was never preordained in any of us. We'll never know what our theoretical potential was in any of us individuals, and we'll actually never know what we're capable of unless and until we absolutely maximize our resources and our time and our efforts, and of course the true maximum is also theoretical. None of us will ever quite get there, but the closer we can all come as individuals, and the closer we can come as a community, as a culture, to putting the right values in place and the right resources, the better process we can all develop and pursue whatever our interests are. So that's the distinction I try to make: is that talent and intelligence are processes. They're not things.
Yeah, and that really connects to the other idea of genes and the environment. And you take the concept, which has been posed for a long time in our sort of, I guess, our culture and general consciousness, of nature versus nurture. Which is predominant. And as you're saying, there's no real thing there that's any theoretical potential. But you say it, so it's not one or the other, or even them added to. But we have genes and we have an environment. So aren't we just genes and environment? I mean, what's really different about what we now understand about the interaction?
Right. Well, the old way was additive. This is the way of thinking of genes: is that genes have actual information about what traits are supposed to be like, and when it comes to complex traits like talents, abilities, types of intelligence, that we have genes that are kind of that dictate a certain amount of intelligence, if only we can nurture ourselves to get to that ability. But in fact, that's not how genes work. Genes do have information, and that information does get translated into proteins. Those proteins do get translated into pieces of us, which then do end up becoming traits of all levels of complexity. But genes are not blueprints the way we were taught. Genes don't have, there really isn't a gene, even for something as simple as eye color. There's no gene inside you that says, well, this is a blue-eye gene, you're going to have blue eyes. This is a gene for being extremely tall. You're going to be between 5 and 6'7". Genes have information, but how that information translates into actual traits of a developing person depends constantly on how those genes are impacted by the environment around them and by other genes. So it's an interactive process, and you can't ever isolate a gene and say this gene is destined to become this one trait, or this handful of genes is absolutely destined to become this one trait. It just doesn't work like that. Now that raises a whole different level of complexity, and it's very, very difficult to describe, and it's hard for people to even wrap their heads around that, because we have been taught to think about genes in this certain kind of direct, linear way, that genes become traits, and genes are basically our genome is a book of the information of what we are to become. But it just turns out that that's not the way genes are. And when you understand that, and you try to communicate that in a reasonably intelligent way, you realize we're talking about a whole new paradigm of who we are and how we can become, and it really takes away the whole concept of innateness and destiny and preordained abilities and puts us into a whole new realm of potential.
Yeah. Now, perhaps the classic example of that is what when we think of child prodigies, or the Mozarts, or the other people who seem to have this enormous talent that just seems to come with them into the world. And you sort of debunk that to some degree in your book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And people who haven't read the book by now have realized that this book skips around, and it's a big. It's not a big book in terms of pages, but it covers a lot of ground, and it tries to synthesize a lot of different pieces of science. We're not sitting passively here and just talking about one thing. Obviously, we're covering a lot of ground, and for that reason, anyone who's seen the book knows that I back up everything that I'm saying with copious notes in the back, so that if it went too fast for you, if you want to see where I got that certain characterization, you can go look it up yourself.
That was extremely helpful. I mean, there are so many books that have just lots of assertions and stuff and pieces of information, but being able to track how they all come together, I think, was just really, you did us all a great service.
Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate that. Well, it was also a real credit to my editor, who has at Doubleday, who's the editor-in-chief of Doubleday, Bill Thomas, who has never published a book like this before. To put this many footnotes, the footnotes, or the endnotes, really end up taking about half of the volume of the book, and that's pretty much unheard of in a trade book, in a general interest book. So it was a credit to him that he saw that what we could do is make a very compelling book, which he suggested we call the argument, the first half of the book, and then the evidence is the second half of the book. But to get back to your question, yeah, that's right. So if you look closely at the lives, what's happened to us over many, many centuries and decades in the more recent sense is that with this certain conception of genetics and this certain framing, this certain paradigm of nature versus nurture, and all the different paradigms that we've kind of grown up inside, certain myths grow up to fit those paradigms. So we have this sense of nature versus nurture. We have this sense of built-in innate abilities, or at least innate potential, and plugged into that over the last couple of centuries has been this idea of some people being born with this extraordinary ability. That they have it so early that there's no other explanation other than it's just built into their genes, and they're lucky and we're not. And it turns out, if you look at the particular lives that all of these people have led, whether it's Tiger Woods or Mozart or Michael Jordan or Einstein or just any extraordinary achiever, that's just not the story that ends up getting told if you look closely enough. These people are extraordinary. They do extraordinary things. In some cases, they do pretty extraordinary things early on. But if you look really closely at their lives, you can actually see those lives in development, and you can actually come up with perfectly rational explanations for why this person was particularly focused at this age, why they had extraordinary resources that simply couldn't compare to resources available to other children, in the case of young children, and on down the line. It actually does make sense why Mozart was doing some pretty phenomenal things early on in his life, and you can kind of bust through this idea, it happened so early, it just isn't explainable, so it must be genetics. I could talk more about Mozart in particular if you want, but I don't want to babble on and on if you want to go in a different direction.
Well, I think maybe we can springboard from that, since a lot of the folks who are listening in today are educators or learning specialists of various kinds, and work with a lot of kids, some of whom are gifted, some of whom aren't. But if we look at those, one of the questions that I think is interesting, and maybe you have some thoughts on this, is you talk about in the book that most gifted children don't actually turn out to be superior performers as adults, and there are some who continue to evolve, but why is that, and then what do you think that suggests for gifted education? That is, we have a system in this country in many areas where we identify certain children as gifted, and then we put them in a special program.
Right. Well, let me first say I don't think we should be using the word gifted, because gifted is one of those words that comes loaded with this kind of old paradigm understanding. The word gifted is just like the word innate. It kind of suggests that someone has a certain amount of something. They're different, inherently different from a person who isn't gifted, and they've got more potential. Now, I'm not saying that by the time these people are identified as gifted that they don't have something really good going on or really interesting as compared to someone who isn't classified that way. And I'm not saying that we should try to educate everyone in exactly the same way, or we shouldn't pay attention to people's abilities at any age. But I think we should try to avoid using terms that imply that this stuff is that it's a certain amount of stuff rather than a part of a process. Because as you suggest in your question, it's true that when you actually look and understand what people are, what these prodigies, what these particularly exceptional young kids are doing early on, and how it compares with what they do as adults, you really kind of bust through a whole bunch of myths. For one thing, an awful lot of kids who appear to be truly exceptional in one area as kids don't end up being very exceptional in that or in any other area as adults. And there are a couple different reasons for that we can talk about. Another thing to know is that there's a certain problem with being actually labeled as gifted, which can end up going against every incentive that you want to give someone who is developing into hopefully a truly superior performer. That is to say, the central lesson of becoming good at something is to learn how to fail and to learn to take risks and to pick yourself up from failure and to push yourself actually beyond, just slightly beyond your abilities, and experience little failures all the time, and then focus in on those failures and try to learn where you're not quite succeeding, and add little skills to the abilities that you have. And what we end up teaching, unfortunately and accidentally, we end up teaching a lot of these kids who do well at something early on, is we teach them that they've got something, they're lucky to have this certain something, and we put them on stage, literally or at least metaphorically, and we say, do this thing for us and keep doing it, and we praise them for it. But we give so many of them the sense that that they should stick to what they do. They should stick to that particular ability, and they should play it safe because they, in fact, get rewarded for being better than average in these certain abilities. And we end up not rewarding them for taking risks and for pushing themselves beyond their abilities, and it ends up being this very kind of backward system of incentives.
Yeah, and I do want to explore just a little bit about what you think stands in the way, and whether it's sort of the pressure of, well, I always have to perform because this is what everybody tells me I do so extraordinarily well, then gets in the way and makes it really, they won't take risks because they can't fail, and that would just be so devastating to their sense of who they are. Right. Is that what you're getting at?
It is. That's a more articulate way of what I just said. That's what I'm trying to convey, that we want people to learn to be risk takers, to be comfortable with failure, and indeed to be disappointed in themselves, and to not be so devastated that, of course, they won't come back to it. We want to promote a certain resiliency, but there's this dynamic that we want to get kids into. We want them to them to understand that it is a process, it's not a thing, and that failing at something, being disappointed, not quite doing, living up to a certain capability at a certain time is not a sign that they can't be good at something. It's just a sign of skills they haven't yet picked up, and then we want to give them in really tiny incremental ways that feeling of accomplishment, that feeling of, hey, look what happens if you fail at this one little thing, and then you apply yourself. You figure out what it is that you couldn't do, and you apply yourself, and you keep applying yourself until you pick up that skill, and look how you get better at that something. And once that feeling is internalized of failing, being disappointed, but being determined to go out and get back on the horse, as it were, and figure out what you didn't do well, and then applying yourself until you do it, and then feeling that sense of accomplishment over time of having failed but then gotten better at it. That is the sense that you build into someone, and it becomes a kind of rewarding dynamic that then kids can take and apply anywhere in their lives for the rest of their lives, and become it isn't just applicable to that whatever domain they're in. It could be applicable to absolutely anything in their lives as long as they live.
So you're also talking then not just about gifted children, but about children maybe who have some special needs or who have sometimes they're referred to as exceptionalities or different ways of learning, or maybe classified as special ed. And there are a lot of kids in those categories who really have struggled a lot and who maybe have had a lot of trouble being successful. There's been a pattern of I don't want to say failure, but I struggle, and maybe it hasn't been as rewarding. How do you, even you've got kids in high school who just have been who haven't been nurtured in the kind of way you're talking about. How do you get them to trust and believe that they can do this? I mean, do you have any suggestions on that?
Well, the how is where we get way beyond my pay grade. The how is what I'd like to hear from the 47 people out there, and every, because this is not what this is maybe another book, and I'd love to know the answer to that question. I mean, I can give you some thoughts on it, but basically, I think that's the real trick is how do you get the kids who haven't learned that lesson yet, particularly kids who've had more than their share of struggle and have seen a lot of failure but very little success, and really are beaten down by the sense that they don't have potential, that they don't have even the ability to learn any of the skills that they'd be interested in learning. And how do you kind of get them over that emotional hump, and then how do you find that one thing that is going to teach them the lesson that resilience is the way? I mean, that can be really tricky. On the other hand, we do see all around us so many examples constantly of people who struggle and struggle and struggle, and then they find somehow, accidentally, usually it has something to do with something in their lives that they just really love or have some particular incentive to be good at. Quite often it's kids who are not good at academics, but there's something about street culture or something that they do want to be really, really good at, and they learn the lesson that way, outside of school, outside of a typical academic environment. But then they could go on, once they've learned the general lesson, and they could, if they wanted to, and if someone points it out to them, they could apply that lesson back to the academic environment if they so wished.
I love the way you talk about it being irrepressible and resilient in the book. In fact, there's one sentence that really is my very favorite. I think I'm going to post it on my wall. So you say that the single greatest lesson from past ultra-achievers is not how easily things came to them, but how irrepressible and resilient they were. which I think what you've just been talking about. And sometimes I see that parents or teachers even, they want their children or their students to do well so badly that they'll almost try to do anything for them and do whatever they can to prevent failure. But you're talking about the importance of failure, in fact, the essential nature of it as part of this process of developing talent, and it suggests a different approach to failure and motivation. What would your advice be to parents and teachers on this?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I experience this as a parent all the time. I think every parent, I've got two kids. I've got a 14-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy. And so, I've been in this in this business of raising kids for a while now, and I've experienced, thousands or millions of times that feeling of just wanting to step in and make them feel better, do something for them, kind of assist them enough that that the shot goes through the hoop, and say, hey, you did it. And of course, I think first of all that's a very understandable feeling. There's nothing wrong with that feeling. We want to support our kids. Secondly, there's a certain amount of that, a certain amount of assistance that's required, that's a part of supporting them, giving them this kind of emotional reservoir in the sense that you can, succeed. So there's a certain amount of that that's fine, but there is a fine line, and it's so easy to cross. And I know I've crossed it myself, God knows how many hundreds or thousands of times, of putting in a little too much assistance, a little too much doing for them, a little too much, hey, you did it, even though, hey, I did it for you, and not quite enough of, you know what, I'm going to sit back and let you fall on your face on this one, and I'm going to let you figure it out, and I'm going to telegraph to you either verbally or just by not doing anything. I believe in your ability to figure this out. I'm going to let you pick up the pieces here and learn this lesson yourself. And once you do that, I know you're going to take that little bit of confidence and that little life lesson of being able to do it yourself and apply it to the next lesson and the next lesson after that, and you're going to start, a snowball effect of being more and more successful on your own. So I think it's that combination of making sure your kids know you love them, you support them, you're never going to let them, fail so badly that they're in a dangerous situation. You're always going to be there to help give them advice, et cetera, give them the right resources. But that you're also going to let them and trust them enough and show confidence in them enough to let them go out on their own and make their own mistakes and pick up the pieces where they fall, because that process is absolutely invaluable. And if we do too much of it for the kids, as you said, you're absolutely right. We're really doing them a disservice.
One of the audience members asked a question about how young kids, or at what age, how young can you actually start to talk to them about this and give them these insights into the fact that it's a process? What point do you think they could?
Oh, I believe that it starts right away. I mean, I'm not a child psychologist, so there's I can't put this into clinical terms or anything, but just my experience as a parent, resonating with all of the lessons I've learned from science and putting these ideas together in the book, tells me that there are all sorts of intuitive and even nonverbal ways that you can try to find the balance I was just articulating with kids right after they're born. That's the feeling I have thinking about my own kids, is that and not that I am brilliant and just knew all this stuff as soon as they're born. I am lucky enough to be the spouse of an educator who is quite progressive, and I think actually intuits a lot of this stuff on her own, and kind of taught me the value of this from the parenting point of view very early on. So I don't think that there's an age that's too young to be trying to convey these basic principles. Obviously, how you convey them is going to be very age dependent, though.
Sure, absolutely. So if we now move into sort of the school environment, and you comment in the book that that schools are really and curriculum is built around the notion of giftedness and talent, and whether you have it and whether you don't, and that schools would look different and curriculum would look different if the notion of talent as a process were widely understood. So what exactly do you mean by that, and do you have some thoughts about what that would look like?
Well, here's where I'm going to, again, plead a little bit of ignorance. I don't think that I don't know how strong I state that in the book. I don't think that schools are, utterly, that all schools that I'm familiar with are just utterly, bankrupt of this notion. And I don't think that they're all, built completely wrong, that they all reward, all the wrong things. Obviously, a lot of education works very well for a lot of people, and there are a lot of wonderful teachers out there who either know this stuff consciously or have intuited it. So I think there's an awful lot that's going right out there. I do think that we need to, as we look at where schools aren't working and where teachers aren't doing well, and where in specific situations with certain students where it's just not going well, that this paradigm is something we can pay very close attention to. And I think maybe that's particularly true on either end of the spectrum when it comes to these so-called gifted kids. I think we need to be very careful. I think it's perfectly fine to say, hey, this kid is doing so well, performing so far above this grade level, we should not be teaching them, 5th grade math if they're doing 11th grade math. It would be not only boring for them, but it would potentially lead to all sorts of destructive behavior. We want to be challenged. We constantly want to be finding that point in every individual where they're challenged just beyond their ability, and then helping them kind of scaffold up to new levels. So we want to do that with kids who are performing extremely well, and then at the other end, we want to, as we've already talked about, we want to try to find a way to impart these lessons to kids who have struggled so much in their lives and still haven't found really that doorway into successful academic lives. And to me, that means just finding any life lesson where they can understand the basic truth of it's okay to fail. Whether maybe it's a literal thing you need to tell them as a part of a lesson, or maybe it's just something you need to show them in conjunction with something that they're interested in doing. But it's okay to fail. It's all achievers. Anyone that they admire in life has failed, constantly fails, and they're good at something and very, very good at something because they have failed and because of how they've responded to that failure. So I think that, those are the basic lessons. How you actually integrate that into curriculum, that's...
You'll leave that for another day, I guess.
Exactly. I'd love to learn that from other people.
Yeah, okay, great. One of our participants wondered if you view any particular kinds of activities as important builders of intelligence. Of course, you've talked about intelligence not as a process, so maybe it's just creating those structures. But are there some things that you can see that could be done in schools or in school-like situations to help increase students' learning potential?
Well, I don't think this is necessarily going to be what the questioner was asking for, but I'm thinking of how we approach tests and what we tell kids about what tests mean. And I think one of the great discoveries I made in researching the book was reading what Robert Sternberg has written recently, and how well it dovetails with everything else that we now understand about genes and talent and intelligence, which is that we need to think of all tests as skill tests, as tests of achievement so far. So whether or not and that applies to a midterm, American history test. What have you learned so far, and how well have you learned it? And if you haven't learned it, if you get in the 75 and you missed all these questions on the test, what does it mean? Does it mean you're dumb in American history? No, it means that you just haven't learned this stuff, and let's figure out a way to make the knowledge more interesting to you, and let's learn the facts and the lessons that will help you, get 100. And apply this exact same thinking to IQ tests, these so-called ability tests that purport not to measure achievement, but somehow tap into our inner innate abilities, and that's just false. What all of these tests doing, and I'm not putting down the tests themselves. I'm simply putting down how they get misinterpreted. What all these tests are doing, including high-level IQ type tests, is they're tapping into their achievement tests. They're tapping into skills that we have or have not learned in our lives up to that point in time. And so I think that's absolutely critical, that we help kids understand that as they get tests back, on all these different levels, and they see all these scores, kind of being thrown at them, that it's never an indication of what their potential is. It's never an indication of their true inner core innate ability. It's only an indication of what they've been able to achieve, and that's not to belittle the work they've got to do or the road that's ahead of them. But it also isn't saying the point is it's not saying here's the ceiling and you're never going to break through it. We just need to find out the reason that you're not achieving more in this particular domain.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not deterministic. It just is. It's where you are at a particular place in time, but it's
exactly.
not where you can get to. Okay. One of the studies that you talk about in the book is very familiar to many educators, and that is the work of Hart and Risley, who did the study that showed that children from low socioeconomic status backgrounds hear many fewer words and hear in more negative tones and all that kind of thing. And sort of some of the concerns that maybe Head Start, which is designed to try to enrich some of the experiences of these children before they get to kindergarten and first grade, may not be really able to counteract the effects of those early effects of environment. So does that suggest that there really are windows for developing some of these things, that there is some genetic control over it, or that the programs themselves maybe just aren't delivering what they need to these kids?
No, I don't think it suggests anything about genetics, and I'll say another word about that in a minute. But I think it suggests that as I think you said in part of your question, it suggests that the very, very early development, the part that we're just not getting to early enough, the stuff that's going on behind closed doors, starting from quite literally the day of conception, not just the day of birth, but the day of conception, that all matters. It all matters tremendously, and it's not just individual parenting. It's also culture, and by culture I mean family culture, community culture, media culture, national culture, world culture, anything that can be any sort of input on the lives of these kids, that verbally and visually and through sounds and through in any other way is just not giving them their is just not optimal.
That's pretty intimidating as a parent. I mean, to think that all of these things, many of which you just not even thinking about, or if you had to think about them, you'd drive yourself crazy trying to optimize everything.
It It is. I think that I've seen people get actually very upset about the message in my book because I think it actually, on one level, is extremely comforting to parents to think that a lot of this stuff is out of their hands. And in the way they think about it being out of their hands is, well, it's, my kid has certain genes, and so they've got a certain, set of abilities or at least potential, and, I'll do my best to help them along there, but a lot of this stuff is just not even, in my power, or even in any sort of nurture realm. And I think that's wrong. I think that's quite wrong. Now, I don't think, let me rush to say, I don't think that means that there's any parent out there now or has ever been or will ever be a parent who truly has complete control over these things. First of all, a lot of it is simply too subtle to understand. Secondly, a lot of this stuff is a lot of these influences are well beyond our individual control. As I just tried to say, a lot of this stuff is culture. So what I think is hopefully going on in the book is people are understanding that there's a shift of how we're not in control, and that's very important. We're used to thinking of not being in control in a biological sense, that there's this kind of innate biology that's just kind of given to us. The real way we're not in control is that we inherit so much about our culture, our ideas, even our nutritional, any sort of environmental, nutritional, atmospheric, sensory experience. So much of that comes to us as new parents, and it's just given to us, and there's not a whole lot that we can do about it. Yes, we can choose which neighborhoods to live in. Yes, we can choose, what friends to hang out with and what books to read and things like that. We all have free will, and we can make differences in our own lives. But a lot of it is very, strongly shaped by certain bookends. It's very bookends. It's very, very, very structured. So I don't want people to think that I'm saying, hey, if your kid doesn't turn out well, it's all your fault and you screwed up and you should have just, figured out this recipe and done the perfect job. I think, parenting is an impossible job, and we don't have anything close to perfect information, and we all do the best we can with the cards we're dealt. But if we think about the cards we're dealt as being different from being genetic cards, and we think of them more as being in the realm of our environment and our nurture, if you will, the difference there is at least we have a chance to learn about this sense of development. At least we can slowly but surely pick up little and big clues about what this developmental paradigm is all about, and we can improve. And that's a very exciting idea. Yes, it does carry a huge burden as a parent and as teachers and even as citizens, but and I accept that burden. But it's also very, very exciting that we don't really ever know any of our individual potentials, and the best we can do is just learn about this developmental paradigm and keep learning about it and then keep improving on it.
So one of the things I hear you saying is that whether the topic is U.S. history or learning to read or becoming a world-class teacher or being a great parent, we have to remember that those too are processes and that there's going to be some failure and there's going to have to be a little bit of risk, and that the whole notion is we ought to feel good about the fact that we can, if we work at it and practice it right, get it better.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think of parenting in that sense as being in exactly the same paradigm as me being a writer, me being a guitar player, me being a person who goes out and bicycles on in the park, or me being a runner. Anything that I do in my life that I want to be better at, that I care to be better at, that I think is important for me or for other people to be better at. Hey, I know that I've already lived, half a life here, and there are certain things that are kind of, ingrained and aren't likely to change. I'm 45 years old. I'm I'm not likely to spend a lot of time, requisite time and effort to go from being a perfectly mediocre soccer player with my tired, creaking bones to being an exceptional soccer player. But yes, all of us can look at the lives we lead, can look at the skills we have in any domain that's meaningful to us, and can and should be constantly critical about what our current abilities are, should push ourselves to our limits, should welcome little tiny and even bigger than little tiny failures, and after we experience a little bit of a few hours of disappointment in those failures, should say, okay, what was it that didn't quite go right, and let's get better at that next time. And let me just say one other thing while I'm on this little tear. One of the things I learned in writing the book, and I actually started saying it a lot before I actually started doing it, but now I have started doing it, is I think we can show those as adults. We can show those failures to our kids in our own lives, and we can do it in a fairly naked way. So I have actually made it now a new habit of showing my kids. We sit down for dinner every once in a while. If I've had a really terrible day because I've been working on a project for a week or 2 weeks or sometimes several months, and it just isn't going well, or it, in fact, maybe is beyond repair. I've sent in a book proposal or something, and it's not going to be a book because my editor doesn't like it or my agent doesn't like it. I will share that with my kids, and we'll all be sad about it, and they'll feel a little sorry for me. I'll certainly feel a little sorry for myself, and it won't be the greatest feeling in the world. But I know, because I do have a certain amount of resilience, and I know my kids know because I have been able to, have a little, certain amount of success in my life in this domain, that I'm not going to stop, with this failure. I'm going to come back the next morning. I'm going to try either this same project or another project, and it may be a couple of months, it may be a couple of years, but there is going to be a success, and it's going to be a great success because I'm not going to give up until it is a great success, no matter how many failures there are along the way. And we're all going to rejoice in that success, and we're all going to look back and we're going to remember those failures along the way and how they were a part of the process. So you can show your kids and even your spouse and your friends this process, which often is very, very slow, but you can show that to them over time, and you can all kind of revel in how it works over time.
That's a great message. These principles have been in existence ever since humans have existed. Obviously, we see more of it, we understand more of it now because of the neuroscience. But do you think there is anything new and we're living in a different time than we were, even 20 or 30 years ago, with lots of technology and lots of other kinds of things? Do things like mobile technology or some of the challenges or speed of change, does that make it harder, or does that just not make any difference in trying to develop talent and ability?
Let me before I answer that question directly, let me say that there is something that's happened in the last 10, just very, very recently, the last 10 or 15 years, in terms of science, that has enabled us to see these principles, which I think you're right are kind of age-old principles, but to see them in a whole new way. And that is really two different things. One is we've been talking about brain plasticity for many, many years, but only in the last 5 or 10 years have we really understood how profound brain plasticity is, have we really understood that every single moment, every single decision, every single thought you have actually physically changes the shape of your brain. So your brain physically is in this process of development, not just as a child, but throughout your life, and that is continuous till you take your last breath. It is constantly this plastic developmental thing that's literally going on inside your brain. And in terms of genetics, this sense that we've already talked about of how genes really have, genes do have information, but the actual traits that are going to come out of that information depend. they absolutely depend on the process of interacting with the environment, these genes almost literally being turned on and off like switches by environmental impulses. So that sort of interactivity and the plasticity is really new, and it's giving scientists a whole new way to embrace these ideas that we've been talking about. But I think you're asking a very different question about how, whether technology and our kind of, busy mobile, digital lives are perhaps getting in the way, or are they enhancing our ability to kind of apply these lessons? That was your question, right?
Absolutely, yeah, exactly.
Okay. Sorry
but
for
I
that
really liked hearing the other. I liked hearing the other stuff too, because I think it's striking to me, and as just a quick interlude, as a former teacher who was trying to figure out how my students' brains work, and knowing nothing about it, has been just astounded over the last several years at what we've learned. So it's an amazing time.
So in terms of technology, I think that I've written a fair amount about technology previous to these more recent books, and so I do think about it a lot. And I think that the tools we use do have profound influences on our culture and on our individual actions, on the way we think about things. I don't think that technologies are neutral. I don't think that technologies are irrelevant. I think that all these things do shape us. And I'm generally of the belief that in technological progress, I should say, I do believe that tools have enhanced our abilities in just many, many cases to learn more, not necessarily to learn more faster, but certainly to communicate in all sorts of rich ways, to acquire information and apply that information. And so I think the tools we use generally, we use for a reason, and I think there is a kind of general arc of progress that technology has served for us. But having said that, I also think that there are tremendous challenges that come with these very recent technologies, namely computers and kind of mobile computing and the information revolution that's upon us. And I think the big challenge is what I called in one of my books data smog, or this idea that we are living not only in an age of information and amazing communication where, I can get an idea, find out about a person who knows more about that idea in some little town in India, and find out their email address, email them, get a response, and have this whole interaction going and build on that idea in a matter of minutes, where before I might never have even been able to find out about that person, let alone communicate with them. So all sorts of opportunities, but also this incredible challenge of trying to sort through the data and stimulus, and also not be overcome by the thrills and the distraction of being constantly in contact with people and machines, and carving out spaces for in our lives every day to make sure that we are actually communicating in rich and deep ways, and thinking in rich and deep ways, and not just living on the surface of texting a few characters here and there, and waiting for that next tweet or text message or short video burst or what have you. Not to say that any of those forms can't impart real ideas. I think they all can, but the danger, I think, is really never allowing ourselves time and space to sort things out in our own brains, and not having what can be really full, long, uninterrupted conversations with ourselves and also with people around us. One of my favorite ways of conveying this, even though this is now so so dated, It's almost embarrassing to talk about it, but I still think that talking about call waiting is a great way to think about technology. It once upon a time, the phone was something that we used to call someone, and we would, if we were lucky enough to get that person, and we each had time on our hands, we would just talk, and there'd be a conversation, and maybe it might be a 5-minute conversation about what we're having for dinner, or maybe it would turn into a 45-minute or 90-minute conversation that is unpredictable and starts out with one thing and ends up building on itself and going from idea to idea to idea and ending up in a kind of profound place. And then we got this thing called call waiting, where someone else who was calling could interrupt us, and we had to make the decision about whether to take the call or not take the call. But at the very least, we'd probably look at, find out who's calling and figure that out, and we'd interrupt our conversation. And I feel like we're in this world now where we don't allow ourselves, or we're rather, to put it a different way, we're allowing our own tools to interrupt the conversations that we want to have in our lives. So, we don't call it really call waiting anymore, but in all sorts of ways, we are doing one thing, and before that one thing can evolve into what could be a really, really rich experience, conversation with one or more people, or interaction, or what have you, something else comes in, and we cut it short. And it's fun to be cut short. It's fun to constantly go from one thing to the next and feel like you're living this kind of peripatetic life. It's very thrilling. It's like being in an amusement park. But the thrills are very surfacey, and I feel like we're robbing ourselves of a lot of potential depth if we're not aware of these dangerous distractions. So that's kind of one way. I mean, there are many different ways to answer your question about technology, but that's one way to think about all this, is that, there are lots of opportunities, but also lots of pretty serious challenges, I think.
Well, it seems like that would have some significant implications, too, as schools adopt more technology and figuring out a way not to make it just a series of quick transactions where kids are just sending stuff around, but to use it actually to enrich and to deepen the conversation, not to rev it up to the same speed as everything else in our lives.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that I've always been wary of bringing more technology into school, not because I don't think there are lots of neat opportunities, but because I think the assumption is often in a school that's not working well, it's here's a poor school, it doesn't have what this other rich school has, and if we just got some of the latest technology, then they'd be up to date and they would be participating in this information revolution, and people would be able to search stuff and do all the stuff that the rich suburb does. But that's, of course, really not what education is all about. Education is about people who appreciate ideas and can work with kids in smart ways and can teach them how wonderfully exciting it is to learn things. And you can use technology to do that, but we also know that we've had many centuries pre-digital technology, pre-computer, where all we had was the book, and it was far from impossible to find ways to get people excited about learning just using that technology. So I think we leap too quickly to think that the next technology is going to be the cure-all, I think.
Right. Well, we're just about to bump up against our hour here, so I'd like to close with a question going back to to your initial comment about your interest in running the book and sort of finding an area that wasn't widely understood in the general public, and these concepts that you talk about in your book that we've been talking about today seem to me to be so profound in terms of their implications for how we live our lives and interact with each other, that it's really important for this to be much more broadly understood. And do you see that changing, and how do you see that changing, and what do you think it's going to take to get that the kind of cultural shift that goes from, well, I either have it or I don't, to it's my job in my life to build it?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not sure. I think my sense when I was researching the book and writing the book was that this is going to take a while. There are a lot of words we use. There are a lot of stories we tell. There are a lot of myths that we have created that are built around this idea of you either have it or you don't. That help those of us who aren't particularly successful at something kind of feel better about that and kind of ascribe it to something that was beyond our control biologically, as we've talked about. Ways of thinking about superachievers as just being this almost separate class of human beings that just have that, have the right stuff. And I think all those words and phrases and stories and myths, that you add all those together, that's a way of thinking. So I think it's going to be challenging. I think it involves new phrases, new ways of thinking, new stories, new myths. On the other hand, there are a lot of people that are talking about this stuff now. There's a whole realm of people talking about brain plasticity and how, and of course the idea behind that is that we can always change, and that as we make decisions in our lives and expose ourselves to different experiences, we physically change our brains and indeed our bodies. There's a whole almost a library of books now that are coming out about talent and intelligence that are really, I think, very much complementing what I have to say. There's even some overlap that seems threatening to my editors and marketers, but I think actually all the books that I've seen so far really just complement each other very nicely. There's a book called Talent is Overrated. There's Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers. Daniel Cole's written a book about talent that's wonderful. Can't remember I'm blanking on the title right now, but quite a number of books that are really bringing these different pieces of science together and also going into schools and seeing how they comport with real world experience and I think slowly rewriting the way we think and talk about this stuff. But I generally think that it is a slow process, and it's going to take at least a generation to really turn things around. Which is not to say that, as individuals and as, small groups, we can't just take the ideas now and run with them. But I think in terms of really, a sea change, I think that's going to take a while.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate your role in doing that. We've got some other folks who now can participate in that, I think, from this discussion. David, thank you so much for your time today and your insights. I know everybody enjoyed it immensely. And hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you, Betsy. It was great to be a part of this. It's been great to talk to you, and thanks to everyone out there for listening and sticking with it. And I'd love to hear back from people who get a chance to read the book and have further thoughts, because as I've said several times, there's a lot that I don't know about the stuff, particularly in the realm of education. I'd love to learn, how this stuff applies. Oh,
I expect you'll be hearing from some.
Good.
That's great. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody, for participating today. And we'll be talking to you soon. Bye-bye.